I would like to welcome you again on behalf of the organizing committee of the Social Boundaries of Work Critical Labor Studies Conference. We started yesterday in the library of the University of Wrocław, and today we start the so-called academic part, even though it's never fully academic. It's always a mix of various things, because we as academics are also part of labor movement. And I'm very pleased to pass the floor to Agata Krasowska, who will chair this session.
Good morning. I would like to warmly welcome you to the plenary session entitled Critical Labor Studies in the Times of Polycrisis. The session fits in with the main theme of the conference by highlighting issues of workers' experiences in polycrisis, unpaid work, and precarious inequalities, and collective action in the context of democratic regression. And we have pleasure of hosting three wonderful guest keynotes. Michele Ford, she's online. Callum Cant and Valeria Pulignano, who came us from University of Sydney, University of Essex, and Catholic University of Leuven. And each person was asked to give a 25-minute introductory lecture. After this lecture, we can ask 2 or 3 clarifying questions. And at the end will be the discussion. Now, let's keep to presentation Callum Cant, who is a senior lecturer in Essex Business School and the author of 2 books on artificial intelligence, algorithmic management, and platform capitalism, Writing for Deliveroo and Feeding the Machine. And he's an expert member of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, a research affiliate of the Oxford Internet Institute, and co-editor of the Worker Writing Journal. He takes an interdisciplinary approach to questions of work, technology, and crisis. His current research focuses on workers' experiences in crisis in Britain. And it will be a lecture titled Things Can Only Get Worse, Worker Experiences of Polycrisis in Britain.
It's a pleasure to be speaking to you all today. I hope that what I'm talking about, which is going to be kind of at a more theoretical level initially before moving on to the empirical, can complement really what Michele was talking about in terms of authoritarianism and bring it into the Western European context. So the title of this paper, for those not familiar with the memes of British politics, is a play on the song Things Can Only Get Better that accompanied the final TV advert before Tony Blair's landslide 1996 general election victory. At that moment in time, a Labour Party that had pivoted to the right and made an accommodation with the core tenets of neoliberal doctrine delivered a significant electoral victory for the third way. For its fans, Keir Starmer's 2024 election victory, again for the Labour Party, was a similar moment, although perhaps preceded by an even sharper turn to the right. However, as the inversion of the title implies, I disagree, because 2024 is fundamentally unlike 1996. The relationships between the contradictions that structure these two moments are profoundly different. And today what I want to do is try and articulate a theoretical paradigm that allows us to grasp that difference, and then elaborate a concept of authoritarian management to describe what that difference looks like on a concrete level. So, as in the title of this conference, we could describe the process driving the differentiation between 1996 and 2024 through the concept of polycrisis, defined, I think, broadly as a collective term for the interlocking and simultaneous crises of environmental, geopolitical, and economic nature. This concept is in broad usage, in part because it communicates so forcefully a pattern that everyone can observe at an empirical level. And indeed, at an earlier stage of my project, I thought this was going to be one of the concepts that I really lent on in my future work, hence its inclusion in the title. But the more I thought about the polycrisis, the more dissatisfied I became with it. My position now, I think, is that the communicative simplicity of the polycrisis hides some profound theoretical problems. So today I want to begin thinking about a theory of crisis that can grasp our moment by superseding the polycrisis. Yeah, great, thank you. So the prolific left liberal historian Adam Tooze has been one of the Polycrisis' most influential advocates, and his Chartbook newsletter charts its development in minute detail. So proceeding on the basis that we should challenge ideas in their strongest form, I want to begin with his deployment of the idea. So this is a 2022 Financial Times editorial titled "Welcome to the World of the Polycrisis," and Tooze opens his account of the concept by defining its simplest element, a singular crisis. So he says, a problem becomes a crisis when it challenges our ability to cope and thus threatens our identity. This starting point is very significant, I think, for two reasons. First, because in attempting to understand the polycrisis by moving from one crisis upwards, Tooze gives us a clue as to the kind of internal relations between different crises that are implied by the concept. And second, because his definition of the problem crisis threshold implies a particular subject. So let's examine these two in turn. First, Tooze's definition of a crisis hinges on a relationship to a particular subject. The problem crisis threshold is crossed when its impact grows large enough to disturb that subject's stability. In a polycrisis, lots of these crises occur simultaneously and amplify each other. So the shocks are disparate, but they interact, so the whole is even more overwhelming than the sum of the parts. So if we were going to sketch the crisis, we might think of it as something like a large hub and spoke network. On the left, you have my very amateur drawing. On the right, the World Health Organization, I believe, or no, World Economic Forum's attempt to do the same. So at the center, we have a subject surrounded by disparate crises which have different origin points, but all add up to produce an amplified effect. Perry Anderson has criticized Adam Tooze for his tendency to repress structural explanation and rely on the deployment of a vast scope of empirical detail in its place. I think the same criticism applies here. This is a model that's quite capable of describing many crises, but without any account of where they came from or how they interact with each other. We see instead the economic, the environmental, all occurring from separate places, converging on the singular subject. But let's go back to Tooze's initial statement. So a problem becomes a crisis when it challenges our ability to cope and thus threatens our identity. There's another implied theoretical stance here that we have to deal with. Our ability, our identity. Who are we? This subject is the orienting point around which his concept of polycrisis is organized. So obviously it's wider than the readers of the specific FT article he's writing at the time. I think instead we have to understand Tooze's standpoint here as something like a general political humanism. The we he wants to conjure with is the we that stands behind in the face of the polycrisis. It's the we of we the people. This we does not exist in the abstract, but is in fact the basis for a very specific kind of social organization. A universal representative that in its ideal form is produced by the people, directed by the people, and advances the interests of the people. Now, this social organization is, of course, the state. The source of this particular theory of the state that Tooze is implying is, I think, not particularly hard to locate. We can go back to Hegel and find his discussion of the relationship between the state and the people in their mediated form of the family and civil society as a clear precursor. So I won't read the whole quote at you, but here is essentially Hegel's statement in the Elements of the Philosophy of Right of what his theory of that relationship between state and people is. This state is one in which the state emerges as a logical result of multiple competing interests. So the existence of different rights, for instance, the right to private property, embedded in the institutions of the family and civil society, come together to create a duty to support an arbiter that can sit above and resolve those conflicts. So the combination of right and duty creates the state as an objective universality. This is Hegel's phrase, and I think it's a very important one. An objective universality, and in doing so unites the particular interests of a diverse range of subjects. It creates the our that Tooze is referring to. So I think we can kind of consider Tooze as a Hegelian here, who believes that Geist will progress over time towards a form of rational action that unifies the particular with the universal interest. And maybe this isn't unexpected given his political starting point, right? Tooze is essentially a left liberal Keynesian, and left liberal Keynesianism has always taken the form of a managerial discourse from the point of view of the state, which refrains to a certain degree from a critical analysis of its own foundational claims. So this lineage of thinking about the state allows us to decipher his somewhat critical statement about identity. What is the identity of the state that is threatened by the polycrisis? To use Hegel's terms, the state's identity derives from its universal objectivity. Maintaining that identity means reproducing that objectivity over time. Maintaining our identity in the face of the polycrisis therefore means stabilizing our states in the face of potentially destabilizing effects. But it also goes wider than that, since the state is the guarantor of the particular interests that derive from the social relations below it. So defending the identity of the state our state means defending the identity of the productive relations on which the state is based. So as the central point of the polycrisis, the state is meant to act on our behalf to keep the social relations of production within a certain window of adaptation, despite being threatened by these amplifying crises. This hub is the location where we, the universal people, can make decisions about how we manage these external crises. But by maintaining the identity of the state, we also maintain the identity of the wider social formation. We stabilize the state in order to stabilize society. This is ultimately, I would argue, the main theoretical assumption undergirding the concept of polycrisis. Tooze actually goes further here. He says that the diversity of inputs into the state now means that we face a different kind of challenge. So he gives the example of the 1970s and says, well, at that time we could deliberate between different responses, and then it was possible to pick a single solution to a single problem and pursue it. Whereas now the diversity of the polycrisis poses challenges of another magnitude. So it tests the limits of the state to facilitate our stabilization, and therefore potentially requires some kind of new political solution that remains, I think, very indistinct. So after this discussion, I think it's possible to see why the communicative power of the polycrisis concept is such a problem for critical labor studies. The idea of the polycrisis represses structural explanations to the crises we face and replaces it with a description of the crisis through a profusion of empirical data. If you think back to that World Economic Forum diagram, you have point after point of different stressors, but no real model of the relationship between them. It also perceives all of this data, perceives all of these crises from the standpoint of the bourgeois state, which is imagined as truly universal and rational. And as a result, it misses both the class character of the state itself and the existence of class struggle as the fundamental basis of capitalist societies. And finally, I think the concept implies a political program of stabilization, whereas in fact, a political program that's adequate to our moment has to be based, I think, far more on rupture. So if we start by accepting uncritically the polycrisis concept, we're never going to get anywhere. Instead, we need a material account of the current situation. So what is the alternative? So I want to propose that we, maybe a different we this time, based on the particular standpoint of the working class rather than the state, have to get to grips with the exact nature of the situation facing us today. That's an indispensable basis for a kind of revolutionary theory that's adequate to the seriousness of our historical moment. But if we use the concept of polycrisis to try and generate it, we will get nowhere. Instead, we need other sources of theory and other methods of inquiry. So today I want to talk about two concepts derived from Louis Althusser, which can provide a scaffold for thinking about the specificities of this particular moment in time, particularly through overdetermination and conjuncture. So this section, I intend to move very quickly. I apologize if I make any leaps that are difficult to follow. Hopefully we can chase those up in discussion afterwards, if so. So firstly, overdetermination. In one of the essays that make up his 1965 book, For Marx, Contradiction and Overdetermination, Althusser sets out to distinguish what is specific about Marxist dialectics. So basing himself on a reading of Lenin in 1917, Althusser argues that the contradiction between capital and labor cannot be accessed in its pure form. It always exists in a specific social body, embedded in a set of factors that are mutually impacting each other all the time. Althusser begrudgingly uses the concept of overdetermination to describe this, a concept he borrows from Freud. So we can summarize overdetermination as the name for a relationship between factors that's not one-directional cause and effect, but instead complex and emergent back and forth relations that create a proliferating overspill of mutual effects. Okay, yeah, I can do. He quotes Marx and Engels. The capital-labor contradiction is never simple, but always specified by historically concrete forms and circumstances in which it's exercised. The class struggle is always overdetermined. This succinct theoretical rejection of Tooze's surprising argument that the polycrisis reflects complexity that has no historical precedent. No, history has not attained a new level of complexity over the last 4 years. Perhaps the task of bourgeois state management has become more complex, but these two are not the same thing. So rather than disparate crises with independent origins all accumulating around the state, the model I want to use is one where the contradictions between classes produces a network of overdetermined contradictions. This network does not have a universal center. Instead of that hub and spoke model where we have crises surrounding a singular subject, Althusser's concept of a structure articulated in dominance is, I think, much more useful. So Althusser argues that the very existence of a structural unity of many contradictions in one historical moment indicates they're held together through domination and subordination relationships. So complexity for Althusser implies domination as one of its essentials. It's inscribed in its structure. If contradictions could simply be added together to produce the totality through an accumulation of simple elements, if we could just, as the World Economic Forum does, add together all these crises to get the whole, then we could say that there is no inherent structure of domination and subordination between them. We could have an unstructured view of the polycrisis as a profusion of data. However, the fact that they interact, the complex whole has to be structured in dominance, according to Althusser. So here, I think we get to the heart of what the Marxist view of the polycrisis, or the Marxist critique of the polycrisis, should be, that these disparate crises are not just instead spread out on a flat plane, but instead structured and interacting with one another. So if we throw out a conceptual model based on disparate crises converging around the state, and we have to come up with a complex network of emergent relationships of mutual determination, we achieve, I think, two key things. So first, we open up the possibility of structural explanations that can connect different contradictions to one another. We no longer see the environmental and economic as different planes, but rather as interlinked phenomena. By making those connections, we can grasp our moment as a social formation structured around a very particular set of social relations of production. We have to understand our moment as based on a particular kind of economic foundation, and this economic foundation as producing the polycrisis, as producing the diversity of phenomena that are kind of explained away through these massive range of data points. Instead, there is a point of convergence that we can understand these through, a structure in dominance. Second, this model, I think, brings class struggle back in as the foundation of any analysis. Rather than papering over the cracks with a false universality of the state, we can start to understand how the polycrisis emerges through antagonism and through class struggle fundamentally. But what does this look like in a particular moment? What does it mean to talk about overdetermination at a specific point in time? This is where I think Althusser's concept of conjuncture is essential and should in many senses replace the polycrisis. So Althusser's published writings never dealt much with Machiavelli, but according to one of his students, Emmanuel Thoré, his teaching never strayed very far from reference to him. So one of the vital concepts that Althusser works out with reference to Machiavelli in some unpublished work that was not available in his lifetime is the idea of the conjuncture. So he calls the conjuncture no mere summary of its elements or enumeration of its diverse circumstances, but instead their contradictory system, which poses the political task and indicates the historical solution ipso facto, rendering it a political objective, a practical task. So rather than rendering a specific historical moment as a collection of data points, Althusser's Machiavelli sees the elements of the conjuncture as a system of forces whose relationships structure the possible forms of political practice. He engages with these forces and relations with a view to achieving a solution to the problems of national unity, in Machiavelli's case, rather than to formulate supposed laws. So since general historical tendencies can only ever actually exist in a specific society rather than abstract elaboration, the object of his analysis of the conjuncture is to help find the forms, means, and procedures of political practice that can lead towards that goal. National unity, in his case, something else in ours. Althusser understands Lenin as a key next step in this lineage of conjunctural analysis. In another essay from the 1965 for Marx on the materialist dialectic, Althusser again looks at Lenin in 1917. Althusser at a certain point becomes very predictable, right? If he's starting thinking about the present moment, he really does have one reference point. His writing from that year, Lenin's, is filled with discussion of the relationship between different factors. Rather than just describing an empirical profusion, Lenin draws these parts into an analysis, understanding the relationships of overdetermination that enmesh one with another, not seeking to reduce factors to a phenomena of simple contradiction, but engaging with them in their complexity. So his analysis in 1917 does not apply to a general history or even a more specific imperialism. Its object is the concrete present, the exact moment of the historical situation. So the concept of conjuncture identifies a different way of approaching the overdetermined relationships between factors, and it's one that is based on a standpoint of action. So the analysis of the conjuncture from the point of view of the working class points the way towards a specific problem that has to be solved at the level of practice. It turns the class struggle from an abstract factor into an ongoing dynamic, open to intervention and reconfiguration. Rather than the stabilization of the state and productive relations it's based upon, our task from this perspective is one of destabilization. We live in a system in which many of our states are enthusiastic participants in genocide in Palestine, in which the ongoing destruction of our climate calls into question the viabilities of billions of human lives, and in which the everyday indignities of alienation and suffering are the background noise to the terrifying acceleration of fascism. I, for one, have no particular desire to stabilize that. And I don't want a conceptual framework that's orientated towards that stabilization. The goal of our analysis should not therefore be to understand the specific ways in which the contradictions inherent in the mode of production are working themselves out now through the polycrisis, but rather through the conjuncture, with a view to understanding the political task that conjuncture poses to us who are committed to working class emancipation. So with that theoretical discussion done, I want to turn very briefly to some of the empirical work I've been doing in Britain and what any of this actually means in practice, right? So if we throw the polycrisis out the window, we go with an analysis of conjuncture instead. We take these kind of Althusserian steps to try and think of, rather than a field of crises interlinked with each other, instead a structure articulated in dominance. What do we get out the other side? And importantly, to go back to the question I asked at the start, what divides 1996 from 2024, right? My answer is authoritarian management. So with this term, I want to describe how the organisation of work in Britain is increasingly reliant on forms of ruling class power that are generated through coercion rather than consent. So let's begin with a very zoomed out picture, right? From 1870 to 2008, the real wages paid to people in working class jobs in Britain rose, on average, every year from 1% to 3%. When combined with an expanding welfare state and limited political reform, this consistent upwards trend allowed the ruling class to achieve a seemingly impossible task, the partial stabilization of capitalism, a system based on crisis and conflict. So from the late 19th century onwards, Britain's ruling class benefited from rising productivity in the factories, imperialist domination in the colonies, a gendered division of labour in the home, and the relentless exploitation of cheap natural resources everywhere. These combined to facilitate a series of different class compositions that successfully subjugated the working class despite moments of revolutionary potential. So each time the rising costs of inputs, principally labour, food, raw materials and energy, began to place limits on accumulation, a combination of colonial expansion, enclosure and new scientific revolutions opened up a new ecological surplus that could be exploited. These surpluses offered the ruling class room for manoeuvre and allowed it to use working class struggles to drive new processes of development, thereby cutting off the routes that led towards revolutionary situations. But now in the 21st century, that new surplus isn't forthcoming. In fact, the bills run up through past exploitation are coming due. Climate caps is now imposing new costs on production. And the decline of this ecological surplus is occurring at the same time as the actual production of surplus value is faltering. So industrial overproduction and the emergence of global value chains have combined to deindustrialize the British economy, which is now reliant on a combination of financial services, a few select high-tech industries like biotech and cultural production, and a mass of low-wage, low-productivity service work. So this picture is not, I don't think, nationally specific, but rather reflects a wider global economy defined by stagnation in productivity, growth, trade and real wages. Consolidated capital is increasingly seeking value through rent-based strategies that attempt to control markets and extract value from them rather than advance production. Nation states in particular are adopting nationalist policies that attempt to advance the interests of their domestic capitalists, leading to a sharp increase in geopolitical tension. So the combination of loose monetary policy, monopolistic capital using its price-setting power to extract rents, and supply-side costs imposed by the climate breakdown is behind recent spikes in inflation, and makes clear that climate change will be experienced by the working class of Britain and elsewhere as an enduring real wage crisis. So the state's capacity to mediate the abrupt end of long-term trends that helped capital achieve stability has been challenged by the form the state has taken after the neoliberal turn. The debt state, as Streeck has called it, can only manage the process of decline. The British state today is, I want to argue, in a sense, a parachute state, one which operates to forestall decline, to slow it down, to mitigate its worst elements, but without ever actually offering a convincing counter possibility of growth and revitalisation. Whereas in 1996, Blair to come to power and attempt to re-articulate a new settlement to the British working class based on growth in financial services, deregulation, and so on. In 2024, there is no similar option. So the near future is, I think, divided between the fortunes of a burgeoning asset-owning class that can rely on profits extracted through market rents, and a working class forced to undergo a gradual reduction in living standards, punctuated by occasional crises which intensify their immiseration. So this will, and perhaps already is, lead to a sharp increase in zero-sum distributional conflicts. Between classes, this will look like a fight over the ratio in which value is divided into wages and profits, and within classes, it will look like forms of racist and xenophobic violence. And in Britain, I want to argue that we're already seeing that, right? We had a strike wave in 2022-23, where levels of strike activity returned to those not seen since 1989, where the real wage crisis caused by these conjunction of factors was responded to through workplace activity. But we also saw within the working class racist, pogromist violence in the riots of earlier this year. And what do these larger trends look like on the ground? So if I've identified this macro context of increasing antagonism both within and between classes, what does it look like in workplaces? So over the last year, I've been conducting interviews and observations in a range of workplaces, schools, hospitals, platform delivery, logistics, and the steel industry. And my basic finding across all of these is that there is this increasingly antagonistic relationship clusters around 4 key vectors, right? So the first of these is algorithmic management and the deployment of semi-automated digital tools to surveil, supervise, discipline, and coordinate workers. This was initially most obvious, I think, in the platform sector circa 2016, but it's now proliferated across a range of workplaces, including warehouses. So Braverman's accounts of Taylorism in this account remain as relevant as ever, albeit realized through new technologies. Second, the widespread adoption of precarious employment and non-employment as the new standard. So the direct employment relationship, which was the norm through the historical window of the post-war period, is no longer that norm, with outsourcing, agency work, self-employment, and short-term contracts proliferating. In addition to this, the complete breakdown of labour inspection and enforcement means that the rights theoretically granted in law cannot be realised by most workers in practice. If you want to bring an employment tribunal in the UK today, you have to pay yourself and wait 2 years. And this means that in essence, there is no system of labour inspection operating in the country at a fundamental level. Third, the adoption of increasingly antagonistic approaches to industrial relations by both the state and capital are very obvious. Here, I think we can really chime with the Southeast Asian example, particularly with the 2015 Trade Union Act in Britain, which has been described by not particularly radical Oxford professors as authoritarian, and attempts to introduce minimum service levels, which would essentially break the power of major industrial unions in the country. And we can also see this in the way that multinational corporations like Tata, DP World, and Amazon are increasingly adopting hardline approaches in bargaining with both workers and the state. And fourth, we can see the operation of a new post-Brexit migration scheme that's creating principally 2 groups of hyper-exploited migrants. So the first are undocumented workers who function as a low-paid urban surplus population and work for well below the cost of reproduction in the service sector. And the second, forms of borderline unfree labour in agriculture, meat processing plants and care homes, organised via new industry-specific visa systems. So just to give you some colour on that, I mean, I've been interviewing some agricultural workers who have worked under the kafala system in the Gulf states, and their assessment of the kafala system versus Britain's migration system is they far preferred the kafala. They actually made enough money to send significant remittances home, whereas in Britain, they're not guaranteed the work to be able to do that. So that we have seen the emergence of post-Brexit, an extremely draconian scheme. So what does all this mean? I think the concept of the polycrisis is an inadequate way of grasping these interlinked challenges. It doesn't give us the tools to understand our conjuncture because it represses structural explanations and orientates the world around the standpoint of the bourgeois state, in the process completely failing to recognise centrality of class struggle to historical development. Instead, the theoretical accounts of crisis we use should build on models of social conflict that can understand the connections between different contradictions and the structuring role of the social relations of production. When we do this, we can understand the centrality of class conflict to the development of these contradictions and how they create unique situations at the operation of general historical tendencies. Attempting to do this in our present conjuncture in Britain leads us to understand an ongoing shift in the organisation of work in the direction of authoritarian management, best observed through those 4 vectors: algorithmic management, precarious employment, antagonistic industrial relations, and a post-Brexit border regime. I think this is, in many ways, we could expand to say, a realization of trends that have long existed in the global south in a kind of boomerang effect, right? We're all very familiar with the idea of Césaire's boomerang, that the Nazi regime in Europe was the realization of violence that actually began in the colonies, but merely imported back into Europe itself. We can also think, I think, to a degree about the super exploitation of labour power in a similar way, and the way in which forms of exploitation that began in colonial exploitation to extract the maximum of absolute surplus value are coming home to roost in the advanced capitalist economies. So this is how I'm approaching the theoretical challenge of thinking about production at the intersection of many crises, and the empirical challenge that hopes in that. I hope this has been of some use, and that we can work together to advance these questions a bit further. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Valeria Pulignano. She's a professor in sociology at the Center for Sociological Research in Catholic University of Leuven. She's titularis of a Franquist teaching research professorship and a member of Leuven, Catholic University of Leuven, Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and fellow at University of Warwick and Luxembourg, and co-researcher at Center for Globalization and Work at the University of Montreal and Laval in Canada. She has published extensively on topics related to the sociology of work, comparative European industrial employment relations, labor markets and inequality, working conditions, job quality, and workers' voice. She serves as principal coordinator of the research network on work, employment, and industrial relations within the European Sociological Association, and as a member of the executive committee of the Industrial and Employment Relations Association. She studies the forms of unpaid labor in the platform economy, creative industries, and care, and the way in which she accounts for and develop a measurement of precarious work. She's editor of Work, Employment and Society, and previously chief editor of Work, Employment and Organization, Frontiers of Sociology. She sits the board of several international peer-reviewed journals in the area of sociology of work, employment, and industrial relations. And it will be presentation entitled Unpaid Labor. There is a change? No. Unpaid labor and inequality in precarious work. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agata. And yeah, thank you again for inviting me. Oh, yeah, that's the thing. So yes, in fact, it's a bit of surprise. So yeah, because I was thinking about how to tackle what we have been doing and we are doing. And I've introduced also yesterday in the session with Carol and what this conference is about. And, now linking also to the presentation of Michele, and particularly the one of Callum, I think that what this work is doing, or what, could do, is to not really theorize the polycrisis. I think it's interesting, the framework you presented, Callum, but looking at the consequences of this polycrisis, because this is what we have been doing, not only myself, but together with, a lot of young researchers in this project called Respect Me, which I said yesterday now is concretized in a book. So, this is also an occasion to disseminate a bit, sorry, the book. Yeah, and exactly, this is what I wanted to do. And I thought that perhaps, one of the let's say, element which to me, at least from a Western European perspective, links to the polycrisis is in fact the issue of democracy and the crisis of democracy. Is the crisis of democracy one of the crises or part of this polycrisis? So is a consequences or is a kind of, if you like, a starting point? And this is why I would like to start from this question. Because in fact there has been, at least in in the Western European side of the world or the global, a lot of debate about wealth inequality, understood as disparity in income. But of course, we do know that wealth inequality is not just an income issue; is also an identity issue. And particularly, the question that researchers have been trying to investigate is trying to say, okay, we know that there is this kind of impact on wealth inequality on democracy, but the question is to say, should something be done about it, and if so, what? So the question is, in fact, doesn't work. Does it work? No. Mm. Okay.
Sorry. It's not right.
Nie, ale to będzie... Okay, the question to Michele and Stelos, who was muted anyway. Michele, can you still hear us?
Yes.
Oh, that's perfect. And I will unmute the... sorry. Yeah, okay. That should be...
Okay, so that's fine. Thank you. So yes, as I said, so there is this crucial question, yeah, about what shall we do about this kind of problem here, and this relates to, in fact, other two important questions, at least to me. The one is, what is the effect of wealth inequality on the emergence of sustainability of democracy, in fact, and what is the impact of democratic government? Oh yeah. Yes, democratic government on this kind of wealth inequality. And if one were basically asked to sum up the received wisdom about these questions, it would be that wealth inequality is bad for democracy, and yet democracies are also likely to implement policies that normally should reduce wealth inequality. Now, let's say that there has been, in fact, a lot of study around this issue, and the kind of results of this study is that there is this kind of idea that democracy involves, in fact, equalizing policies, although, as I said, some of the studies also have been challenged on this kind of assumption from different fronts. And some empirical work done in political science, but also outside in sociology, suggests some other kind of conclusions. So because the distribution of wealth is almost invariably more unequal than is the distribution of income, this same argument should apply even more strongly for wealth. And political scientists here, I think, have spent a great deal of time analyzing the empirical correlates of income inequality, but far less effort has been made so far in the area, in fact, of wealth inequality. The question is to say, why? Well, the reason is simply empirical, because wealth inequality data are generally much harder to be collected. But as we know, yeah, we'll just skip here. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you recognize this very important book written by Piketty, which in fact analyzed, the kind of issue of wealth inequalities in the light of extensive data collected over, decennia of investigation. And what these books points to is the fact that there is a kind of role of government taxation of capital, and that these influences a lot the wealth distributions. And this is emphasized in this particular book. Now, of course, we are not going, and particularly myself, and I think I talk also on behalf of my co-authors, to, confront ourselves with Piketty. But I think what we, from a sociological perspective, I think we have been trying to do in this book is to say, hey, here we also have an important role, as I was saying before, of labor market contributing to create a lot of these kind of inequality. And we need to look at this. We need to try to understand the role of the bad or good functioning of the institutions of the labor market we are confronted to. And when I talk about institutions of the labor market, I'm also referring to the institutions of industrial relations, trade unions, collective bargaining, negotiations, and so forth. And look at the way how, you know, the functioning of these institutions, or perhaps the weak functioning of these institutions, have been contributing a lot to the creation of these wealth inequality. And this is exactly at the core of this book, co-authored also with Markéta Domenka, which I know is not, I think, a well-known name also here in the Polish context. Now, again, you know, this is the results of a collective study. And here you have again a big picture of the people, including Carol, who have been contributing to this study, and I will carry on referring also to the work. Now, let me start first of all from the kind of a question: why are we, or we were interested in understanding unpaid labor? What is the position of this unpaid labor? Yesterday, you know, we tackled this from a kind of the gig economy perspective. Why the politics of unpaid labor? It goes very much in line with what I was also a bit introducing yesterday, which is at the base of the Respect Me project, the conceptualization. In fact, there is a lot of studies about precarious work inside the market, the paid employment area of the labor market. There is a bit less about the implication of these on socially reproductive labor. Now, going back to what Callum was saying before, the social relations of production, I would also add the social relations of production and reproduction. This is something that is very important, and we see these very much in this study. I mean, socially reproductive labor playing an important role and being squeezed by the creation of unpaid labor in paid employment. So there is a relation there that needs to be investigated, and I really do hope that this could, you know, inform further research around that. Now, this has a lot to do with precarity. Precarity has been studied, as I said before, in this area of the paid area of employment. People have been starting also to address the issue of unpaid labor being an important dimension of precarious work. But what, again, this study probably have been done less is to try to problematize around whether and how unpaid labor entails to precarious work. Because it is true that, in fact, unpaid labor can create precarious work, but it's not absolutely the case, or at least it's a research question, whether precarious work kind of unfolds from unpaid labor. Why do I say this? Because what we have been finding in our empirical study is that a lot of this unpaid labor sometimes is done by people who can afford it, who can support it, who can create structure of resilience around that, who have social capital at home or in the community where they work, in the city, in the territories. But also important institutions here are the collective institutions of the labor market. And this is why we have been finding a lot of differentiation of the kind of way in which this unpaid labor affects the work and life of people across different countries. So we see a lot of inequality also created by that. So our approach here is to say, listen, we need to reposition work at this kind of continuum between the paid and the unpaid, socially reproductive and productive. And the politics, why this kind of politics? Well, the politics come from the fact that what we have been trying to do in our study is to try to, if you like, understand the mechanism through which this unpaid labor is created. So why do people do this? What are the motivations behind unpaid labor? And particularly how people do they support it when they do it? And this comes the idea of the, you know, ideal worker norm. We have been using this kind of paradigm to kind of study the more normative processes on the one hand, creating the unpaid labor on the other side, the resilience in terms of how do people support it. Now, so what are the, well, let me be very clear here. We have been, and we know from legal studies, sociology, political scientists, and I think Callum also in his very famous book, talks for the first time about this unpaid labor in the gig economy as well, which has been, also informative in my own work as well. So, it is true that there is a formality, there is a formal aspect of unpaid labor, which is very much linked to this wage theft and exploitations idea. But there is also another important aspect of the unpaid labor, which is perhaps a bit less investigated, which comes through this informalization, informality, and it's there that the normative processes of unpaid labor play a role. So unpaid labor, being free labor, being voluntary, unpaid labor, and being sometimes also considered, it might be weird to say, a sort of privilege for people. If I do it, it's something that is good. It's good for me, it's good for society. I'm doing something that, gives a bit of let's say, support to others. And it's there in this kind of circle that also unpaid labor as being free labor needs to be investigated. So this privileged idea is also important. Now, also another thing that we have been trying to do, the focus we had was on the organization and division of paid and unpaid labor, and particularly the exchange of economic and symbolic resources, as I said before, for the workers who in fact undertake this kind of work. And therefore is there that we see these kind of inequalities coming very much to the fore. So I said yesterday, how do we understand unpaid labor? For us is this time, effort done. And as I said, it's very class-based. It's very is mediated, through this kind of class-based exploitation. And this helps us understanding how this inequality through, by people undertaking unpaid labor through precarious work unfolds. Now, again, we have been looking at the motivation. We have been asking to people, a lot of workers across these three work areas, creative, care, and gig, about why you do that, and if you do that, why you do it. And we've been kind of looking at the meanings people attribute to these unpaid labor. And here we come up with an important distinction between wage theft, so unpaid labor, which is in fact performed within the area of paid employment, okay, fine, in the labor market, within an employment relationship, but also, as I was saying yesterday, a lot of unpaid labor performed by self-employed people, or bogus self-employed, or whatsoever you want to call them, who are doing income theft, because they are basically, yesterday I was listening to the very interesting panel, a lot of people, and it actually was very interesting for me. I think was one of the worker yesterday talking in a panel say, we come here from Latin America, come here with a wish to do something in this country, to work, to do something for us, to look for freedom. I mean, I found a lot of similarities with the work we have been doing across all these different countries. People, particularly also when they are self-employed, they decide to become self-employed because they really are looking for autonomy, determining their own working conditions, when to work, when to finish work. But then at the end of the day, they are entrapped in certain, kind of circle. And this creates a lot of disturbances. They do a lot of unpaid, they basically get, well, not all of them, but some of them get into this kind of precarity circles. Okay, this is just to give some ideas about the narrative that this book has been collecting. We have been collecting more than 400, but for this book, we have been concentrating on a sample of 129. And we have been also doing working diaries to understand day by day what these people were reporting across these different work areas and across countries. Okay, let me go directly then to the theory of the politics of unpaid labor. So what is this about? As I said, we wanted to understand, the mechanisms, and we found these mechanisms very much linked to this idea of the ideal worker norm, if you like, or the stigma, the stigmatization and power. Now, the idea of the ideal worker is an idea which was, developed, particularly took place, in the 1950s and before. It became a sort of cultural icon to address the kind of cultural expectations in the labor market, delineated by the man, which is responsible for work, work in the kind of area of paid employment, and women, which are responsible for work at home. Now, what for us was important here to see is that now at that time what was normalized was this kind of distinction between women and men and, you know, households and area of paid employment. In our study, we see that now, you know, what is normalized is unpaid labor. Is unpaid labor in the area of paid employment, supported also by the socially reproductive labor at home by women. And, you know, these kind of ideological processes goes also through processes of stigmatization and power. So being punished or being rewarded in the labor market if you actually do unpaid or you don't do unpaid. And there comes also the idea of the, you know, being considered somebody when you do unpaid labor, you wish to reach there and to be rewarded. Sometimes you don't, you are not rewarded, so you're punished for not reaching the point. Or if you don't do unpaid labor, you're absolutely, you know, punished, or you don't get at that particular level. And all this is normalized and legitimized, so through this kind of stigma power, as we call it, which in fact, you know, underpins what we refer to being the reality of unpaid labor. Now, I'm not gonna, you know, in the book, of course, all this is a bit also supported and underpinned by theories of stigma. We start from Goffman, but also we move a bit further than Goffman. And we look particularly at the sociology of work, and particularly the work done by Imogen Taylor, who has been, you know, working a lot around this idea of stigma, and has been, in fact, you know, arguing that the nature and extent of the support also given to people to develop certain tasks and activity requires the appreciation of the causal role of power structures like class, gender, ethnicity, and so forth. And in particular here, Taylor refers to the histories of power reflected through hierarchies at work, which are underpinned by structural changes under neoliberal state policy, which mediate the capacity of workers and individuals to retune their self-image against stigma. Now, we found this very interesting and important because, in fact, we see a lot of role of state policy mediating this kind of capacity of workers, and we see a lot of processes of stigmatization. Has also some American sociologists have been underpinning here and underlining, and Imogen Taylor also reports in her work, a stigma is not something detached from power. Stigma is a kind of serving the logic of power, is serving the logic of the dominant class over the dominated, and in fact is and needs to be understood within this exploitative apparatus, which is a device for thinking more deeply how power etches itself into us, and therefore, you know, is not divorced from these power relations. And that's from where we start in terms of understanding the mechanism of stigma, the punishment and the rewarding mechanism, which we have been able to uncover through our narrative interviews and working diaries, people reporting a lot about this kind of stigmatization being underpinning the reason why they do or they don't do engage in unpaid labor. But of course then, and this comes the linkage to the other side of the coin, the resilience, and where wealth inequality comes through. A lot of people, you know, engaging for whatever, for this, you know, mechanism of stigmatization, also report that sometimes, you know, they can support this unpaid labor they engage to, and sometimes they don't. And there comes, you know, the linkage between unpaid labor in the paid area of employment and socially reproductive labor, where in fact we see, and this is particularly the case of care, we see a lot of working class women who not only have to do unpaid labor as usual in care services at work, but also, you know, at home. And of course, these creates a lot of difficulties for them then to exit the kind of area of precarious area of work where they are entrapped in care. At the same time, they also sometimes are in the household supporting the unpaid labor of their own husband, because, you know, in the majority of the cases, at least in our narrative, we see that, particularly in care again, working class women, they tend not to be married with wealthy middle class men, but they are mainly married with working class men who are struggling also in the labor market. So you see there this kind of traps going on and creating a lot of inequality. Now, as I said before, we also see the resilience built through this institutional support of the labor market. And what we come up as an outcome here is the fact that regulatory arrangement and state policy, they shape a lot of, you know, these unpaid labor and the way how unpaid labor is navigated or can be navigated by people. Unpaid labor, you know, can foster employability, but can also arrest people in precarious work. And this happens particularly when people, working class people, women, you know, a specific ethnicity group, they are operating in institutional contexts where these institutions are weak. There, the risk to become precarious, to be, in fact, to enhance kind of inequality in precarious work is much higher. Now, I will give, I don't know whether I have the time to go very briefly through some of these, of the empirical results. I mean, I will not present quotes or whatsoever because, you know, I hope you will read the book. But I will just tell you, yes, I will be okay. I will tell you just what we have been coming through our cases. So, as I said, unpaid labor is, you know, supported by class. So, you know, we see a lot of class-based inequality in this story of unpaid labor, but also unpaid labor reproduces class structures because of the reason I told you earlier, but this kind of resilient stuff. What do we see in the creative industries and in care, reflecting and illustrating all these? Well, in creative, we focused in the book, particularly in the case of dance, ballet, where, you know, you have much more middle-class people, white, preferably, rather than black. And we see here what we call being a no-binary relationship between unpaid labor and precarity. What does it mean? It means that if you do unpaid labor by these people in dance, you actually not automatically get into precarity. Why? Because simply your class structure, you know, helps you in supporting this unpaid labor. And this happens in different formats, through networking, sort of social relationship, having at home somebody who can support you, and all this kind of thing. In care, the situation is completely different. In care, which is a very highly feminized sector, and we have been studying particularly here, UK and Germany, two different, completely different institutional contexts, we see a kind of binary relationship between unpaid labor and precarity, in the sense that doing unpaid for these, as I said, working class women means particularly being entrapped in a story of precarity. So it's very difficult for them to exit the kind of precarity trap. What about the gig economy? In the book, we focus on freelancing, online freelancing. And what we see here, we see, you know, some similarity with the work which has been done by Vili Lendovirta and Martin Daly, in the sense that when you enter gig work, class-based structure seems not to exist. But when you enter these platforms, we found, interesting enough, that, you know, these digital platforms exacerbate class-based inequality and differences through what? Through their own business models, the strategies of the platform. We see a lot of, you know, differentiation here, depending on the way in which platforms work. These, in fact, exacerbate or not class-based differences, and in fact support, you know, this kind of trap again we were talking about. And here I want to refer to the work we've been doing with Carol in ILR Review, the paper, where we're also, you know, trying to understand these kind of inequality or differences across product market, but also across the meaning earnings and effort bargain, the capacity of these freelancers to bargain their own prices and conditions when they work through platforms. And also there, we point to the differentiation across the different platforms. So how do we see our work contributed to existing debates in sociology, but also in economics? We have been trying to be brave here as well. So let's say precarious work. Well, we think that perhaps by bringing in this dimension of unpaid labor, which has been already studied, we are not the first one. We don't claim a dominance in investigating unpaid labor. But perhaps, you know, the scope, the wider scope of the empirical work we have been doing around this unpaid labor probably helped us also disentangling the different forms of unpaid labor, measuring it, and also highlighting the fact that unpaid labor is not just free labor wage theft, but is also income theft in the area of self-employment where fragmentation is higher. And this is where we need also to pay a lot of attention and further investigate. The second is the social division of labor. Again, we cannot understand precarious work if we don't link the paid employment, the area of paid employment with socially reproductive labor. And we see and again, we are not the first one saying this. There's a lot of research done by feminist studies around this. But perhaps, you know, what we are doing here, we are trying to kind of link the dimension of unpaid labor. So how this unpaid labor in paid employment is still supported by socially reproductive labor and is exacerbating what, in fact, Nancy Fraser talks about, the crisis of care. And the third one, we want to contribute to capability approach in economics. I'm sure you know all this kind of interesting approach by saying what? By saying to the people, listen, yes, it's true that people can create and capabilities are very important, but these capabilities cannot be created by the individuals. They have to be supported by the state. State and governments have to support us, have to support, you know, taxi payers and no. So they have to, you know, create that kind of infrastructure. So we want to point the responsibility that, you know, collective actors, state, governments, and the importance of stakeholders, trade unions and employers to carry on, particularly trade unions, to carry on organizing and bargaining on better working conditions. This is how the book looks like. It's more than 320 pages. Don't be scared in reading it. And that's how it looks like. So it will be issued in February and it will be open access. So you don't need to pay for it. But please order a copy for your library. Because we paid a lot of money to have open access. Anyhow, thank you very much.
Hi, Karol Muszyński. I actually have a question to all the speakers, and I would like to start by referring to what Callum said about the boomerang effect. And I think that like one way to kind of conceptualize the changes in the modern economy is to look at the end of organized capitalism, so to say, right? But an alternative view, and I think that Callum kind of supports it, is to look at the sort of like the spread of colonialistic, imperialistic practices, kind of going back to the global north, right? But I think that this alternative approach also has some conceptual implications, which is the fact that maybe we shouldn't necessarily try to develop new concepts to describe the developments in the global north, but maybe refer back to the old concepts that were actually applied to the studies in the global south, right? So instead of talking about authoritarian innovations, we should maybe look at imperialistic practices. Instead of looking at the unpaid labor, maybe we should go back to the concepts of extraction of surplus value, kind of maybe also referring back to what Bartosz said. So what do you think about it? That's just an open question. Thank you.
Hi, Vaga from the Freie University in Berlin. I have a question to Michele. So it seemed to me that there's a lot of authoritarian know-how from other parts of the world that fortunately haven't reached the areas where you conducted field work. Yeah, so the fact that street politics are possible, so it's a bit puzzling from the perspective of places where people get shot if organizing in the streets, if protesting in the streets, or where there's no freedom of association anymore. They can't establish trade unions, and usually the factories are taken over by yellow unions, and so on. And I was wondering, what's the story of the street politics? Are they already too strong for the government to stop them, or what would be the story? Thank you.
Okay, I have very brief question to. Sorry, I'm back. Sorry for technical problems. To Callum, I was fascinated by your critique of Polycrisis, because we do something similar in our project. But we come from what Valeria mentioned, so we come from social reproduction theory, and reach this kind of understanding of Polycrisis as a combination of kind of structural crisis at the level of social reproduction with exogenous shocks. And in this sense, I think you can save the concepts, but you need to redefine it from seeing it as systemic concept to more structural concept, as you suggested with the reference to Marxist theories. I just wonder if this is the direction which you could see as a possibility of saving Polycrisis concepts, if there is anything to save. Yes, because perhaps it's not. Thank you. So I can see no more questions. We can perhaps start with the order now.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for some really interesting questions. I'll start with the question of populism. I am not a political scientist, I should preface this with, but I think the concept of populism for me, certainly in popular deployment, appears to obscure more than it actually clarifies. Because in most instances where we're talking about populism, in the UK context, for instance, we might be talking about a Nigel Farage, right? Or a Tory party that's going further to right at present. What we should really be talking about is fascism. Right, and we have very well developed theories of fascism that allow us to articulate what that actually means. And a section of the working class being attracted to fascist politics doesn't necessarily need to be a surprising conceptual development that requires completely new approaches. We can think about it in many ways in line with a lot of thinkers from the history of Marxist thought. I mean, Trotsky's theory of fascism to me still fundamentally describes many of the phenomena we see. So my approach to how do we integrate the attraction of elements of the working class to the far right during the Polycrisis, during our particular conjuncture, is we think about it along those lines, and we also pay particular attention to the way that zero-sum conflict. So if we exist in a set of social formations whereby the surpluses that allowed consent to be bought are evaporating, and there is increasingly like distributional conflict over who gets what of a limited pool of resources that is not growing at the rate that it used to, that can be an inter-class competition, but it can also be an intra-class competition, right? So it can be about the division of one set of value into wages and profits. It can also be about, you know, who gets the pool of social housing. And this is how we end up in the UK with kind of pogromist violence in the streets, is because that particular articulation that turns that zero-sum distributional conflict into a refugees versus natives, for instance, that line of differentiation. Is the challenge. So politically, I think our challenge, which is a classical one, is to flip that inter-class division into, or that intra-class division into an inter-class division, and articulate it in that sense. But, you know, in the actual concrete circumstances we see at the moment, there are a number of forms of those kind of distributional conflicts not being expressed in clear lines and not being expressed in the obvious ways that it might suit our politics better for it to happen in. This is the nature of the complexity of conjunctures, right? That things emerge that don't necessarily make any sense. The second question on the role of gender, I mean, the role of gender in capitalism is a far greater question than I can answer in 5 minutes or even less. But I think one of the key points that I've been kind of latching onto as I've been developing this, Maya Gonzalez has a fantastic paper on the distinction between indirectly mediated and directly market mediated social reproduction. I think when we are looking at service-based economies where increasingly activities that may have occurred in the home, say 40, 50, 60 years ago, are now being done outside the home via the mediation of capital rather than through unpaid labor, or not even unpaid domestic work as a specific form as the literature discusses it. We have to think about the way in which that reproduction being shifted from the home into the marketplace transforms some of the relationships involved and creates increasingly a large section of the working class that is the gender division of labor is not kind of hiding them away in the home to conduct labor in private, but instead commodifying and treating that labor as part of the service economy. And that for me seems to be like the signal transformation that allows us to think about how that gender division of labor has been kind of reorientated by service economies in a way that is really profoundly important. And when you look back at, you know, discussions of industrial labor in the 1970s, that's one of the key conditions. You know, that social reproduction's commodification transforms some of the dynamics and it produces these large sectors, care, food delivery, service work in kind of many of its general forms, whereby things that were conducted privately and through non-commodified relationships are now commodified. And that seems to me to be one of the fundamental shifts we need to pay attention to. Finally, on the relationship of old concepts, I talked very fast, in part because I cut out a large section of what I'd wrote, which was about Marini's concept of super exploitation, which I think has a lot of relevance for us today in terms of this boomerang effect. And I agree that we can't wholesale go back to just, oh, we'll read Lenin on imperialism and that's everything we ever need to know and nothing has changed ever since. But there is a lot for us to draw from in terms of how those relationships of exploitation based around absolute surplus value extraction do come home. And I agree that returning to some of those old questions is really important, in part because, you know, the labor aristocracy, another old concept, is no longer forming in the advanced capitalist economies in quite the same way, right? And we can see new processes of immiseration taking place that challenge us to think through that transformation of relationships. And then the final question from Adam: what can we save in the polycrisis, if anything? I think this is it's a challenging one because communicatively, the polycrisis is kind of brilliant and you have to admire its capacity to explain certain things very, very quickly, right? I think that's why it makes sense to use it in the name of a conference. That's why it makes sense to use it as the name of an FT editorial or of a paper, because you can very succinctly articulate a feeling in many ways, or the emergence of many intersecting trends that are mutually amplifying each other. And it gives the impression of articulating all of these things together in a structure. But in fact, I think my argument would be it precisely denies them a structure, and it implies a certain kind of novelty. Because I mean, the most outrageous claim from that TOOS article is that in the 1917 crises were simple, and today crises are complex. Right, you know, back then you could like look at the challenges facing society and have one answer. Today, that's impossible. I don't think that there has ever been a moment in history in which a crisis was not poly. Right, name me the one historical moment in which there was a one-dimensional crisis in a simple way. Instead, the way that we can understand this poly nature, right, is to build a model of a structure, of a base and a superstructure, in which we can understand how those causes are interlinked, how those crises are interlinked. And the novelty of the polycrisis is in many ways an obfuscation of, in fact, historical continuities that, you know, society develops through crises. And if we start to try and understand our moment as uniquely multifactorial, we miss all of the historical analogs and all the concepts developed beforehand, which can help us navigate that moment. So whilst I appreciate its communicative ability, and I'm very jealous of the people who came up with it, I think we can't do that. And although conjuncture might not be such an exciting word, perhaps conjuncture and the theory of conjuncture allows us to do something that is, if not as exciting, certainly more accurate and possibly more likely to lead to concrete outcomes.
Okay, so we have the team for the next edition of Social Conjunctures in the World of Labor.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So let me ask to the first question and the last question by Carol together. So how the concept of unpaid labor differentiates from the Marx, valorization and value production. Is it the same, yes or no? Yes and no. in the sense that, of course, the starting point is there. We have, so we see, work intensification, work extensification, value creation, process of accumulation of capital, yes. But there is one thing that, needs to be done, and there goes to the issue of the more gender side. So we do know that traditional, original, before ages ago, there was a dichotomy in Marx's traditional idea of productive, unproductive. This dichotomy was overcome by other Marxists. From an Italian perspective, I can say there has been a lot of work done around that. And also feminist movement have been doing a lot of work in trying to uncover that kind of dichotomy. But still, what we see today, which is different from before, and there goes to the boundaries of work. We see a lot of blurring of these boundaries of work nowadays. And we see it particularly when we look at working time. Supio wrote in 2001 a very interesting book, which was quite of, premonitory sort of, thinking before. He was talking about a fair working, that the division between work and free time, and, free time outside work doesn't exist anymore. And that kind of aspect needs to be, I think, relooked at, and the concept of unpaid labor that we try to push through the book, that's why labor and no work, in a sense, is to conjunction again, the productive and social reproductive. We need to be very transparent in saying that, okay, is unpaid, it can be underpaid because of the wage, you're right? It's not completely unpaid, it's underpaid. But that kind of underpayment creates exacerbates situation of unpaid labor when it links into the household, into socially reproductive labor. And that kind of linkage, that's something that we need to recover. So in other words, I'm not saying no is not, it is exploitation, but it's exploitation overall. It's not only in the area of the paid employment, it's also reconjunction with or having a reconjunction with socially reproductive. So I would say, yes, let's go for I think there is a scope for a new concept there to try to move a bit. I'm not saying, this new concept need to seen as a replacement of old, but as a kind of creating complementarities, so adding element to reflect the changes and the transformation we are facing into our society, because it's not that, things remain the same. And there, the question on the consumption, yes, I mean, you are absolutely right that this is not at the core of our analysis, but, and I know, Miriam Glucksmann also mentioned yesterday, she, in her idea of this kind of, again, relational idea of work, that's what I think is crucial here. She also engaged with the issue of consumers and unpaid labor done by consumers, because at the end, I might guess that is another important element of the kind of triangle and needs to be certainly included into that. And and I will stop. Thank you very much.